The house had been abandoned for so long that ivy had claimed its siding, creeping across broken windows like veins over a corpse. Locals called it cursed, a place where even the wind seemed reluctant to linger. Children dared each other to throw stones at its rotting porch, and adults crossed the street rather than walk past it. To Clara Evans, however, it was not just an old house. It was the beginning of the story that had haunted her since childhood. The Miller house. She had grown up hearing about it in hushed tones over campfires, her friends telling wild tales of a boy who disappeared there in the summer of '89. They said his ghost still lingered, restless, searching. Back then, Clara had dismissed it as small-town gossip. But now, at 32 and back in her hometown, after a failed marriage and a career on pause, she saw the story differently. It wasn't a ghost story. It was a tragedy that had never found closure, and Clara had come to find answers. Her car crunched against the gravel as she pulled up to the overgrown driveway. The late autumn air smelled of wet leaves, and the sky loomed heavy with grey clouds threatening rain. She pulled her scarf tighter, suppressing a shiver that wasn't entirely from the cold. The house had a way of making you feel unwelcome. For years, the name Ethan Miller had lingered like a shadow over the town. He was 10 when he vanished, 10 and full of life, according to the few who still remembered him. His disappearance had rattled everyone, but like many tragedies, the memory had been tucked away, buried under the comfort of moving on. Yet Clara knew better than anyone that unanswered stories had a way of clawing their way back to the surface. Before she went any further, Clara took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here, not just for the story, but for the boy, for the truth. "All right," she whispered to herself, "let's see what you've been hiding." But before we dive into this chilling mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories like this one. She stepped out of the car and approached the house, her boots squelching against the damp ground. The creak of the front steps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence, as though the house was listening. She placed her hand on the cold brass doorknob and hesitated. What did she expect to find? A clue overlooked by police decades ago, a trace of the boy himself? Or maybe just emptiness, a hollow shell of tragedy? "Looking for ghosts?" a voice called out behind her. Clara spun around, heart leaping into her throat. An older man stood by the fence line, his posture stiff and his face lined with age. His piercing eyes studied her with suspicion, though not unkindness. "Just looking for answers," Clara replied, forcing calm into her voice. The man walked closer, his boots crunching through the gravel. "You won't find any here. That house has nothing but bad memories." Clara frowned. "You knew the Millers?" "Knew them?" he scoffed bitterly. "Lived next door for 40 years. Watched that family crumble long before Ethan disappeared." "You're wasting your time." "Maybe," Clara said, "but I need to try." The man stared at her for a long moment before nodding slightly. "You're like David," he muttered. "Can't let go." David, Ethan's older brother. Clara's pulse quickened. She hadn't been able to find much about him, only that he'd moved away after Ethan vanished. "David still lives around here?" The man's jaw tightened. "If you call it living. He's out by the old train yard, doesn't like visitors." Clara's mind spun. David could be the key, the one person who might know more than anyone about what happened in this house. "Thank you," she said softly. The man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist that had begun to settle over the street. Clara looked back at the house, her resolve hardening. Ethan's story wasn't over. She could feel it in her bones, and she was going to uncover it, no matter what. The following morning, Clara found herself driving toward the edge of town, where the streets grew emptier and the houses more sparse. The old train yard, now a rusting graveyard of steel and forgotten engines, was where she'd been told to find David Miller. She didn't know what she expected, an angry recluse who'd slammed the door in her face, or maybe someone who'd been waiting years for a chance to talk. Either way, she needed to meet him. The air smelled of cold metal and diesel remnants as Clara parked her car by a sagging chain-link fence. A distant freight train groaned as it crawled along the tracks, its echoing rumbles adding to the desolation of the place. She pulled her coat tight and scanned the row of small, run-down homes just beyond the yard. She found David's house easily. It was the one that looked like it had given up long ago. The paint peeled in strips, the porch sagged, and an old rocking chair lay on its side, half buried in leaves. Clara took a deep breath and knocked. There was a long pause before she heard shuffling steps. The door opened just enough for a face to appear, unshaven, hollow-eyed, with hair streaked grey, though he couldn't be much older than his early 50s. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, defensive. "Mr. Miller, my name's Clara Evans," she said carefully. "I'm a journalist and I wanted to ask you about Ethan." The door almost closed in her face. "I'm not interested," he said sharply. "Please," Clara said, desperation slipping into her tone. "I'm not here to exploit him. I grew up here. I remember when it happened. I just want to understand. People deserve to know what really happened to your brother." For a moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the loose siding. David stared at her through the narrow opening. She held her breath, meeting his gaze without flinching. Finally, he sighed and pushed the door wider. 5 minutes, that's it. Inside smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and dust. The living room was small, cluttered with old newspapers, tools, and half-empty coffee mugs. He gestured for her to sit on the sagging couch while he lowered himself into a worn armchair. "You said you want to understand," David muttered. "Well, good luck with that." "I've been trying for 35 years. Clara hesitated before asking, "What do you remember about that summer, about Ethan?" David leaned back, his eyes unfocusing as if staring through time. He was different toward the end. Quiet. He'd spend hours in his room drawing. Mum said he was just expressing himself, but I knew better. Something was eating at him. "What do you mean?" Clara pressed. "He kept talking about a door," David said. "A door that wasn't supposed to be there. Said it led to where the whispers live. I thought he was just making up stories. He'd always been imaginative, but—" David trailed off, shaking his head. "The last time I saw him, he was scribbling something on his wall. Told me I wouldn't understand even if he explained. Next morning, he was gone." Clara's heart pounded. "Do you know what he drew?" David gave a bitter laugh. "No, cops stripped the room bare after he vanished. They said they found nothing useful. But I remember that wall. Looked like a map almost. A map of our house, but wrong. Like there were rooms that didn't exist. Do you think that drawing might still be there?" "Under the paint or wallpaper?" David's jaw tightened. "Maybe, but I'm not letting you rip apart that house." Clara nodded, hiding her disappointment. "Do you believe he ran away, or that someone took him?" David rubbed his temples. "I don't know. Sometimes I think he found something he wasn't supposed to, something in that house. And it swallowed him whole." The way he said it sent a chill through Clara. "Do you really believe that?" David looked at her for the first time, his eyes full of haunted certainty. "I believe that house keeps its secrets. And if you're smart, you'll stop digging before it swallows you too." But Clara had never been good at walking away from a story. She left with more questions than answers, and a gnawing sense that the house still had something to say. The public records office smelled of mildew and stale paper, the kind of place where time moved slower and the air felt heavy with forgotten stories. Clara sat at one of the long oak tables, surrounded by stacks of old police reports, newspaper clippings, and photocopied pages from the late 80s. A flickering fluorescent light above buzzed relentlessly, adding to her growing headache. She'd spent hours sifting through the case files on Ethan Miller's disappearance. The original investigation had been rushed, sloppy even. Interviews with neighbors were brief, timelines vague, and half of the leads never properly followed up. It was as if, after a few weeks, everyone, police included, had simply accepted that Ethan was gone and moved on. Her pen scratched across her notebook as she jotted down key points. Timeline inconsistencies. Witnesses reported seeing Ethan near the house hours after his supposed disappearance. No forced entry, suggesting he either left willingly or knew who took him. Family secrecy. Repeated mentions of uncooperative behavior from the Millers, especially the father. Clara frowned at that last detail. David had been quick to deflect when she brought up his family yesterday. Something was buried there, something no one had wanted to talk about. The sound of a chair scraping startled her. "You're not supposed to be digging in those." Clara turned to see a man in his late 60s leaning on a cane near the doorway. He wore a well-worn leather jacket and had the unmistakable posture of someone who'd spent decades carrying a badge. "Detective Reynolds?" she asked cautiously. The man's eyes narrowed. "Haven't been called that in 15 years. Who are you?" "Clara Evans. I'm working on a piece about Ethan Miller," he snorted. "Piece? Like one of those true crime vultures?" Clara bristled. "No, I grew up here. I remember when it happened. I'm just trying to understand what went wrong." Reynolds studied her for a long moment before limping closer. "Plenty went wrong," he muttered, starting with the fact that nobody wanted the truth. People just wanted it to go away. "You were the lead on the case," Clara said carefully. "What do you think happened to him?" Reynolds lowered himself into the chair opposite hers with a groan. "I think we missed something big. The boys' room gave me the creeps even back then, all those drawings, like he was trying to tell us something. But the chief wanted results, not ghost stories. So we treated it like a runaway case. That was the mistake." Clara leaned forward. "Do you remember what was on the walls?" Reynolds hesitated, rubbing his jaw. "It looked like a map. That's what stuck with me. I thought it was just a kid's doodles, but it didn't make sense. There were doors and hallways that didn't exist. I wanted to get an architect in to check the house for hidden spaces, but the Millers shut that down, said it was disrespectful. Then the department told me to drop it. And I did." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. It was clear the guilt still gnawed at him. "Would you help me?" Clara asked softly. "Go back with me, take another look." Reynolds stared at her like she was insane. "You really think you're going to find something the cops missed 35 years ago?" "Maybe," she said, "or maybe Ethan left a message that no one understood at the time." Reynolds let out a long sigh. "You're stubborn. Reminds me of me back then. All right, I'll go. But you should know, if that house has been hiding something all these years, digging it up won't end well." Before Clara could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the quiet room. She turned to see a uniformed deputy standing in the doorway. "You Clara Evans?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Yes?" The deputy's jaw tightened. "Sheriff says you're to stop sticking your nose in Miller family business. If you know what's good for you, you'll pack it up and leave town." Clara felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't flinch. "If the sheriff has something to say, he can say it himself." The deputy glared at her before leaving without another word. Reynolds chuckled humorlessly. "Welcome home, kid. That's how you know you're onto something." Clara stared down at the files in front of her, her determination solidifying. If they wanted her to stop, then she was going to push even harder. Whatever secrets that house held, she was getting closer. The Miller house loomed even more ominously than before, as though it sensed Clara's persistence and resented her return. The sky was overcast, the late afternoon light dimming to an eerie blue as she and Detective Reynolds approached the front steps. He walked with his cane, slower than she liked, but his presence gave her a strange sense of security. He'd been here before. He knew this house's ghosts. 35 years, Reynolds muttered, glancing at the warped siding. And it still smells like mildew and regret. Clara tried a faint smile, but her heart pounded. You really think we'll find anything after all this time? I don't know, Reynolds said, gripping the handrail as they climbed the steps. But I remember that wall, and I remember thinking that boy was trying to say something. Inside, the air was heavy and stale. The scent of dust and rot clung to everything. Clara's boots echoed on the warped floorboards as they made their way to Ethan's old room. She had imagined this moment for days, but now that she stood at the threshold, hesitation gripped her. The room was small, claustrophobic, with faded wallpaper yellowing in patches. The remnants of a childhood bedroom, scuffed baseboards, a rusted bed frame, and a broken toy truck in the corner felt out of place in the silence. Reynolds nodded toward one wall. There, that's where I saw the drawings. Clara stepped closer, her fingers brushing the wallpaper. She could feel the faint texture of something underneath, a roughness that didn't match the rest. You think it's still there? Only one way to find out, Reynolds said. Her stomach twisted as she pulled a utility knife from her bag. She hadn't told David Miller about this. If she had, he'd have slammed the door in her face. Part of her felt guilty, but another part reminded her why she was here. Ethan deserved to be heard. The blade sliced through the brittle wallpaper with ease, peeling it back in strips. Reynolds held a flashlight close as they worked in silence, uncovering inch by inch. Then Clara froze. Beneath the wallpaper, the lines emerged, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't just a drawing, it was sprawling, deliberate, a map. She traced it with trembling fingers. The boy had sketched the entire layout of the house, each room carefully outlined. But it wasn't the house as it stood now. There were extra hallways, strange symbols, and, most unsettling, rooms that didn't exist. What the hell? Reynolds muttered, leaning closer. There, Clara said, pointing to an area near Ethan's bedroom. That's a door, but there's nothing there. It leads nowhere. Reynolds frowned. Or maybe it did. The symbols scattered throughout the map were crude but purposeful. Triangles, spirals, and circles clustered around the extra rooms, as though Ethan was trying to mark them with meaning. Do these symbols mean anything to you? Clara asked. Reynolds shook his head. Not a damn thing. But this, he tapped the wall. This is why I wanted to bring in an expert. It's like the kid knew something was off about this house, knew it well enough to draw it. A wave of unease washed over Clara. The longer she looked, the more the map felt alive, as if it wasn't just a child's drawing, but a desperate message. She shivered. Do you think there's something behind this wall? Something hidden? Wouldn't surprise me, Reynolds said. Back in the day, I suggested tearing the place apart. The Millers refused, said the house was staying the way it was. Clara chewed her lip. Why would a family refuse to search their house when their son was missing? Reynolds' expression hardened. Because sometimes people don't want you to find what's hiding there. The floor creaked behind them. Clara whirled around, heart thudding, but no one was there. Just the empty house breathing around them. You heard that too, right? She whispered. Reynolds gave a grim nod. This place was always like that, like it's listening. The tension broke when Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see David Miller's name flashing on the screen. Her stomach sank. Answer it, Reynolds said. She did. David? His voice was tight, angry. What the hell are you doing in that house? Clara's throat went dry. "You had no right," he snapped. "Stay out of my family's business. You don't know what you're messing with." The line went dead. Clara lowered the phone, her hands trembling. Reynolds watched her quietly, his face unreadable. "Well," he said finally, "I think we just found our next fight." David Miller wasn't easy to convince. He hadn't been when Clara first met him, and he certainly wasn't after catching her tearing away at the wallpaper in his childhood home. But Clara was relentless, and for hours they went back and forth, David accusing her of exploitation, Clara insisting that Ethan had left a message, one that had been ignored for decades. "You don't get it," David said, pacing across his crumbling porch as the wind whipped through the bare trees. "That house destroyed my family. You dig too deep, it'll do the same to you." Clara didn't back down. "David, your brother drew a map of rooms that aren't supposed to exist. He was trying to tell someone something. Don't you want to know what that was?" David stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. He looked older than his years, beaten down by grief and time. "You think I haven't wanted to know? I've been living with those questions for 35 years. But some things are better left buried." Reynolds, who had been quietly leaning against the railing, finally spoke. "With all due respect, David, that boy didn't want this buried. He left that map for a reason." David's jaw clenched. His eyes moved between Clara and Reynolds before he finally muttered, "If you find something and it answers nothing, don't say I didn't warn you." That was as close to permission as Clara would get. Hours later, they were back inside the house, armed with tools, a crowbar, a flashlight, and more courage than Clara actually felt. David stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, clearly torn between wanting to help and wanting to bolt. "Where exactly do you think we'll find this secret?" he asked bitterly. Clara pointed to the wall behind Ethan's closet. "Here. The map shows something on the other side. If he marked it this clearly, it meant something." Reynolds stepped forward first. His movements were slow, deliberate, but there was still a quiet authority in them as he wedged the crowbar into the brittle plaster. "Stand back," he grunted, and with a grunt of effort, he pried the first panel free. Dust poured into the room, the smell of age and decay filling the air. Clara covered her nose with her sleeve as Reynolds worked piece by piece, the wall coming apart like a long-sealed tomb. Behind it was darkness. Reynolds shone his flashlight into the void, and Clara's stomach dropped. It wasn't just a wall cavity, it was a crawl space, narrow, suffocating, no taller than 4 feet. The beam of light revealed handprints on the inside walls, small and smeared with what looked like old dirt. "Dear God," David whispered, his voice breaking. Clara crouched by the opening, her chest tightening. This doesn't make sense. Why would anyone seal this up?" Reynolds' voice was grim. "Because they didn't want it found." She slid inside before she could second-guess herself. The space was freezing, the air stale and heavy. Her knees scraped against the rough floor as she crawled forward, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The walls closed in around her, pressing in like a coffin. At the far end, her light caught on something, a small box, dusty but intact. "Clara," Reynolds called from outside. "I found something." She pulled the box free and crawled back out, her hands shaking. David took a step forward but couldn't bring himself to touch it. Reynolds knelt beside her, helping her pry open the rusted latch. Inside were Ethan's belongings. Old, faded drawings, a toy car with one wheel missing. And at the bottom, a cassette tape labeled in shaky, childlike handwriting, "For David." David's breath hitched audibly. He reached out but stopped short, his hand trembling over the box. "That's his handwriting," he whispered. Clara felt her throat tighten. She hadn't known Ethan, But sitting there, holding this piece of his life that had been sealed away for decades, she felt the weight of his absence like a stone. Why would he hide this here? Clara asked softly. David didn't answer. He just stared into the crawl space, his face pale, as if expecting his little brother to crawl out behind her. Reynolds broke the silence. Whatever's on that tape, it might tell us why he disappeared. Clara nodded, her fingers brushing the cassette surface. It felt almost alive in her hand, a relic of a boy who had tried to speak long after the world stopped listening. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just uncovering answers. They were waking something that had been meant to stay hidden. They didn't play the tape in the Miller house. None of them said it out loud, but Clara felt it too. Whatever was on it didn't belong to those walls. So they drove to David's place, a silent caravan through the darkening streets, headlights cutting through the mist that had crept over the town like a shroud. Inside his small, cluttered living room, David retrieved an old tape player from a box in the corner, the kind coated in a layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been used in years. He set it on the table with shaking hands. Clara sat on the edge of the couch, her heart hammering. Reynolds stood in the corner, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You ready for this?" Reynolds asked David. David didn't answer right away. He stared at the cassette like it was a live grenade. "This is 35 years too late," he muttered. Then, after a pause, "But yeah, let's hear what my brother had to say." The tape clicked into place. David pressed play. At first only static. Then a faint, trembling voice emerged, distorted by time but still unmistakably that of a child. "David?" "It's me." David flinched, his eyes closing as if the sound physically hurt him. "I don't know if you'll ever find this." Ethan's voice continued, "But I wanted you to know I'm not scared anymore. I know where the whispers come from. I found the door." Clara exchanged a quick, uneasy glance with Reynolds. "They don't want me to tell you," Ethan's voice went on, "but I have to. The door is real. It's behind my room, but it's not like other doors. It doesn't open unless it wants to. Sometimes I can hear them in there, talking. They sound like Dad's friends, but different." The boy's voice grew softer, like he was whispering into the recorder. "Don't come looking for me if I go through it. You won't like what you find. And don't tell Dad. He'll just make it worse." The tape cut off with a loud click. No one spoke for a long time. David finally broke the silence, his voice shaking. He knew. He knew something was in that house. "And Dad?" He choked on the word, pressing a fist against his mouth. Dad knew too. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The way Ethan talked about the door made it sound almost sentient, like a living thing choosing when to open. "What did he mean by Dad's friends?" she asked carefully. David shook his head. "Our father. He had people over all the time. Sketchy people. The kind you don't ask questions about. Mom would lock herself in her room when they came." Reynolds finally spoke, his voice low. "Sounds like your old man had more going on than anyone wanted to admit. Maybe those friends weren't just social calls." Clara's mind raced. If Ethan knew something dangerous, maybe that's why he disappeared. Maybe someone made sure he couldn't talk. David's eyes burned with anger and guilt. "And my father covered it up. God, I should have done something. I should have protected him." "David," Clara said softly, "you were a kid. This wasn't your fault." He didn't respond. He just stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the dark street. Clara leaned toward Reynolds, lowering her voice. "Do you believe him? About the door?" Reynolds grimaced. "I've heard a lot of crazy things in my time, but that kid sounded dead serious. Whatever that door was, real or metaphorical, it scared him." Before Clara could reply, a loud creak came from the hallway. David turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Clara's breath caught. The sound came again, like a slow, deliberate step. "Could be the house settling," Reynolds said, though his hand instinctively went to his side, where a gun used to rest in his years on the force. David grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the hallway. "This house doesn't settle like that." Clara followed, despite every instinct screaming at her to stay put. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, heavier, oppressive. "See anything?" Reynolds called. David shook his head. "No, but—" He trailed off, staring toward the door at the end of the hall. "What is it?" Clara asked. "That door." His voice was barely audible. "Sometimes I hear things from there. Always thought it was just my head playing tricks." Clara swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. Maybe Ethan wasn't imagining anything. Reynolds appeared behind them, his expression grim. "Then we need to figure out what's behind that door." Clara stared at the closed door, her skin prickling. Whatever answers lay ahead, they weren't going to be easy. The next morning brought no relief. Clara barely slept, replaying the tape in her mind on an endless loop. Ethan's words weren't just eerie, they felt like a confession, or perhaps a warning. What kind of door did a 10-year-old describe with that kind of fear, and why would his father be involved in keeping it a secret? Reynolds had gone home for the night, but Clara stayed with David. He'd barely spoken since they listened to the recording, keeping mostly to himself, nursing a bottle of whiskey at the kitchen table until exhaustion finally dragged him to sleep. Clara sat across from him now, watching the first pale light of dawn seep through the grimy windows. She couldn't wait anymore. There was another way to dig. By mid-morning, Clara was walking up the cracked sidewalk to a small brick house on the other side of town. Her mother had once told her the old Miller neighbors were still alive, the only people left who might remember what really went on in that house. The woman who answered the door was in her 80s, hair white and wispy, her frame small but upright. "You're Evelyn Kearns?" Clara asked. "That depends," Evelyn said cautiously. "My name's Clara Evans. I'm investigating what happened to Ethan Miller." The old woman's eyes softened at the name. "Poor boy, no one ever told the whole truth about that." She stepped aside. "Come in." Inside smelled of lavender and old wood polish. Clara sat at the kitchen table while Evelyn poured them tea. "You lived next to them?" Clara asked. "For over 20 years, Evelyn said, her voice carrying both warmth and bitterness. "Ethan was such a sweet boy. Quiet, thoughtful, but that house—" She shook her head. "It was never right. There were always strange noises at night, doors slamming, voices when no one was home. And his father, well, John Miller was a mean man, kept shady company. Bikers, drifters, men who didn't belong in a quiet town like ours. We knew he was into something bad, but no one dared ask." Clara leaned forward. "Did you ever see anything unusual in the days before Ethan disappeared?" Evelyn hesitated. "I saw someone I didn't recognize going in and out of the house, not one of John's usual friends, tall, dark hair, wearing a long coat. Always late at night." Clara's pulse quickened. "Did you tell the police?" "They didn't want to hear it," Evelyn said with a dismissive wave. "Back then, the sheriff only did what kept the Millers off his back. Everyone knew John had pull." The pieces were fitting together. A violent, secretive father, unknown visitors, a boy who discovered too much, and a door. "Do you think Ethan ran away?" Clara asked. Evelyn's gaze hardened. "No, that boy didn't leave on his own. Someone took him, or worse." Clara thanked her and left, her mind buzzing. If Evelyn was right, Ethan hadn't just vanished. He'd been silenced. David was waiting for her when she returned. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "You went digging, didn't you?" he accused. "I talked to a neighbor," Clara admitted. "David, Evelyn remembers men coming in and out of your house before Ethan disappeared. People your father knew. One of them might have—" "Stop!" David snapped, his voice raw. Don't you dare say it. Don't you dare turn my father into a murderer. Clara didn't back down. I'm not turning him into anything. But Ethan knew something. That's what the tape meant. He found something in that house, David, and your father was part of it. David sank into a chair, his head in his hands. You don't know what it was like growing up there. Dad, he was dangerous. We were terrified of him. And Mom, she just disappeared into herself, left me to take care of Ethan. Clara softened. You did your best. But if your father had secrets we need to know, it could explain what happened. David didn't look up. There was a room in the basement. Dad kept it locked, said it was his business space. We weren't allowed down there, ever. After Ethan disappeared, he sealed it off, told me if I ever touched it, I'd regret it. Clara's chest tightened. That room could hold answers. David finally met her eyes. If you're going down there, I'm not coming with you. I can't. Reynolds walked in just then, as if summoned by the gravity of David's words. Then Clara and I will handle it, he said. If that room's still sealed, it's time we open it. Clara nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her. Whatever was behind that door, in that room, would change everything. The Miller house was colder than usual that night, as if it knew what they were about to do. Clara shivered beneath her coat as she and Reynolds stood at the top of the basement stairs. David hadn't come. He couldn't. Clara didn't blame him. He'd spent his whole life trying to shut this house out. The wooden steps groaned beneath their weight as they descended. Reynolds went first, his flashlight cutting through the thick blackness. The air grew damp, heavy with the smell of mold and rust. Clara's hand trailed along the rough wall, the grit of dust and flaking paint catching on her fingertips. Been a long time since anyone's been down here, Reynolds muttered. At the bottom, the basement stretched out like a cavern of forgotten relics, old furniture draped in yellowing sheets, stacks of rusted tools, a washing machine that looked older than Clara herself. But it wasn't the clutter that drew her. It was the far wall. There, Reynolds said, following her gaze. The wall stood out from the rest. Its bricks were newer, their mortar cleaner. Someone had sealed off a section of the basement with deliberate care. This is it, Clara whispered. Reynolds set his flashlight on a nearby workbench, grabbed his crowbar, and wedged it between the bricks. Step back, he ordered. Clara did, her heart pounding. The sound of prying brick filled the silence, sharp cracks echoing through the room. It took nearly an hour, but eventually Reynolds managed to create an opening large enough for them to crawl through. The gap revealed a narrow passage leading to a hidden room. After you, Reynolds said grimly. Clara swallowed hard and ducked inside. The hidden room smelled of mildew and something fouler, something that made her stomach twist. Her flashlight beam swept across the space, and her breath caught. This wasn't just a room, it had been lived in. A stained mattress lay against one wall, surrounded by piles of old blankets. A small wooden crate held empty cans of food and cigarette butts. And scattered across the floor were personal belongings, a pair of worn boots, a rusted pocket knife, and a jacket far too big for a child. Someone stayed down here, Clara whispered. Reynolds grunted, scanning the room. Looks like your dad's friends weren't just visitors, he muttered, echoing David's earlier words. Clara crouched near the mattress, running her fingers along the splintered wood of the crate. Who would live like this? And why seal it off? Reynolds bent down, his cane propped against the wall as he examined the mess. To keep people from finding it. Whoever stayed here wasn't supposed to exist. In the corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of blankets, Clara noticed something, a leather-bound notebook, its cover brittle with age. She carefully pulled it free, brushing away the dust. "What do we have here?" Reynolds asked. Clara flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with scribbles, nonsensical words, random numbers, sketches of the house, but as she turned further, the writing became clearer. "It's a journal," Clara said. "Whoever lived here kept track of something." Reynolds leaned over her shoulder as she read. The entries were fragmented, but one phrase appeared over and over. "The boy knows." Her pulse quickened. "This is about Ethan." She read aloud. "The boy's been listening. He knows about the deal. He's seen the door. I told John this was trouble, but he won't listen. If the kid talks, everything falls apart." Reynolds cursed under his breath. John Miller wasn't just hiding someone. He was protecting them. Clara turned another page, her stomach dropping as she read the last dated entry. "He won't stop. Keeps asking questions. If he keeps pushing, I'll have to handle it. No choice." Her hands trembled. This wasn't just a squatter. This was someone dangerous, someone who saw Ethan as a problem. Reynolds' face hardened. "And your dad helped him disappear." The weight of the words pressed on Clara like the air in that room. Ethan hadn't simply vanished. He'd been silenced. "Look at this," Reynolds said, pulling a rusted key from beneath the mattress. "What do you think it opens?" Clara asked. Reynolds pocketed it. "Don't know yet. But if there's one secret room in this house, there might be more." Clara clutched the journal to her chest, her heart heavy with dread. They had uncovered part of the truth, but not all of it. And deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the door Ethan spoke of wasn't just a metaphor. Clara sat at David's kitchen table, the leather-bound journal spread open in front of her. The pages smelled faintly of mold and smoke, like the memories of someone who had no intention of being remembered. Reynolds leaned against the counter, sipping burnt coffee, his face pale in the weak morning light. David stood at the sink, staring out the window with his back to them, unmoving since they'd arrived. "We need to talk about this," Clara said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched for too long. David didn't turn. "No," he said flatly. "We don't." Clara's hands tightened on the journal. "David, your father knew. He wasn't just letting someone stay there. He was involved. Whoever this man was, he talked about deals. He mentioned your dad by name." David's shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. "Don't!" Reynolds' voice was blunt. "He helped cover up what happened to your brother. You can't keep pretending you don't know that." David spun around, his face flushed with rage and grief. "You think I don't know?" he shouted. "You think I haven't spent every damn day of my life wondering what he did, what he let happen?" His voice broke, and he slammed his fists against the counter. "That journal just proves what I've always been too scared to admit." The words hung heavy between them. Clara softened her tone. "David, Ethan trusted you. He left that tape for you. He wanted you to know what he found." "We can't stop now." David sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "My father was a monster, and I let him scare me into silence." Reynolds moved toward the table, pulling the journal closer. "This isn't just about John Miller being a bad man. It's about the associate who stayed there. Whoever wrote this was hiding from something and using your house to do it. And when Ethan started asking questions, he decided the boy had to be handled." Clara's stomach turned at the word handled, such a casual way to describe erasing a child. She flipped to the last page, where the handwriting was scrawled and frantic. "The boy knows about the door. If John won't deal with him, I will. I can't let him ruin this for me." "What was this door?" Clara whispered, more to herself than to anyone. David lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot. "There was a rumor when I was a kid. Dad said there was a passageway under the house, built by the original owner, some kind of bootlegging tunnel from Prohibition. He said it was blocked off, but I think—" He trailed off. "You think Ethan found it?" Clara finished for him. David nodded slowly. He always had this way of noticing things I ignored. He probably found where the wall didn't sound right or saw something out of place. Reynolds tapped the journal. Then this key we found might open it. Which means we're not done tearing that house apart. David stared at them both, silent for a long moment before saying, "If you find it, don't tell me. I don't want to see what's on the other side." Clara hesitated. "David," he shook his head. "No, you don't get it. I can live with not knowing. But if I see it, if I see what my father really allowed to happen, I don't think I'll survive that." His words made Clara's chest ache, but she didn't argue. Reynolds slid the journal back toward her. "You ready for this?" Clara nodded, though her hands trembled. "We need to find that door. It's the only way we'll know what happened." As they gathered their things, Clara couldn't shake Ethan's voice from her mind. "Don't come looking for me if I go through it. You won't like what you find." For the first time since starting this investigation, she felt a deep, gnawing fear, not just for what they'd uncover, but for what it would do to them. Some doors shouldn't be opened. But she had already committed to turning the handle. The Miller house was silent when Clara and Reynolds arrived, as if holding its breath. A cold drizzle had begun, streaking the windows and dampening the sagging porch. Clara's boots felt heavier with every step toward the door, her heart pounding with the knowledge that this was it, the last step toward knowing. The basement smelled worse this time, the stale air, the dampness, the faint metallic tang. It was like the house was rotting from the inside out. Clara followed Reynolds to the far wall, where the bricked-over passage yawned in jagged disarray. They'd left their tools there the night before. Reynolds retrieved the rusted key from his pocket. "Ready?" he asked. Clara hesitated. Ethan's words on the tape replayed in her head. "Don't come looking for me. You won't like what you find." "I don't think I'll ever be ready," she admitted. "Good," Reynolds said gruffly. "Means you're thinking." They crawled through the opening into the hidden room. Clara's fingers brushed the journal in her bag, a reminder of the man who had lived here. He'd been dangerous, desperate, and above all unrepentant. Whoever he was, this room had been his sanctuary. But they knew there had to be more. In the far corner, partially obscured by rotting crates, was another door, wooden, warped, and bound with a rusted lock. Reynolds crouched, inserting the key. It turned with a screech of protest, and the lock fell away. "Moment of truth," he murmured. Clara gripped the flashlight tighter as Reynolds pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Decay, old, suffocating, unmistakable. The beam of light revealed a narrow tunnel, its dirt walls lined with wooden support beams. Bootlegging tunnel, Clara thought distantly, but it wasn't empty. She froze. On the ground, half buried in dirt, were small, brittle bones. Scattered among them were remnants of fabric, a faded blue t-shirt, torn and discolored with age. Her breath hitched. "Oh, God," she whispered. Reynolds crouched silently, his weathered face set in stone. "It's him." Clara felt the world tilt. The truth had been under this house the entire time. Ethan hadn't run away. He hadn't been taken far. He'd been left here, in the dark, silenced and forgotten. She stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her grip. It was one thing to chase the story of a missing boy. It was another to stand in the place where his life had ended. Reynolds reached into the tunnel, carefully pulling out a rusted chain with a small pendant attached, a silver coin etched with the letter E. "Proof," he said softly, handing it to her. Clara clutched it in her palm, tears stinging her eyes. Ethan had left breadcrumbs, a drawing, a tape, his final belongings, and now, finally, they had found him. When they emerged from the basement, the rain had turned heavy, soaking them as they crossed the yard. Clara didn't care. She couldn't stop staring at the pendant in her hand, David didn't say a word when they told him. He sat in his living room, motionless, as Reynolds explained what they'd found. His face was pale, unreadable, until Clara placed the pendant in his palm. For a moment, David didn't move. Then his hand closed around it, his shoulders shaking. He didn't cry, not the way Clara expected, but his quiet sobs echoed louder than any wail could have. "I let him down," David whispered. "All these years, I let him down." Clara knelt beside him. "No, you were a kid. This wasn't on you. You kept his memory alive, and now everyone will know what really happened." David didn't look at her, but his grip tightened around the pendant. 2 weeks later, the story was everywhere. Clara's article, "The Door That Shouldn't Exist," uncovering the truth about Ethan Miller, made front-page news across the state. Authorities reopened the case, and while many of the people involved were long dead, the truth could no longer be buried. David sold the house. He told Clara he was leaving town for good, though he didn't say where. "Somewhere quiet," he said. Somewhere Ethan would have liked. As for Clara, she felt lighter. She'd come home broken, looking for redemption in her work. Now she'd found something bigger: purpose. On her last visit to the house before it was demolished, she stood in the yard, rain soaking her hair, and whispered, "You're free now, Ethan." She turned and walked away, knowing she'd never come back. If this story gripped you as much as it did us, don't forget to subscribe for more and click the video on your screen for another mystery that will stay with you long after it ends.